Hello Internet, I'm Matt Isbell. I'm the Dungeon Master for the Malt Magic campaign, the Forgotten Kingdom of Nihilin. And as we start on this sort of journey into our own live streaming or at least recording of our sessions, I figured it was important to not only give a bit of a background for the group itself, but also for the background on the story and sort of get you guys caught up to where the characters are now. Um, so all of us have been friends for a very long time. Dave, who plays Dargon, was my best man. Ander, or Danny, who plays Ander, sorry, is was one of my groomsmen, and we've been friends since university. I've known Dave actually for almost, well, going on 20 plus years. And then Simao is actually my little sister's boyfriend, so pretty much my brother-in-law at this stage. And sort of following on after my wedding 5 years ago, we set up a regular meet with my group of male friends, doing a number of sort of whiskey and poker nights or whiskey and game nights. And about a year ago now, perhaps a little bit longer, I decided let's try something a little bit different. I'd obviously heard about Dungeons and Dragons, never really played it before. Thought it was cool because I'm a massive nerd, and big up the nerds. We're all nerds at heart. So I presented the idea to the rest of the group, and everybody was game for it. Everybody said, "Yeah, let's try it." So we all went down to Dave's brother's house for a weekend, and pretty much spent the whole afternoon and into the evening with our introduction to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this is my first time DMing. It's the first time for the guys playing, so we're all on this journey together. We're all learning. I did the typical thing of buying the sort of the starter pack with the Lost Mines of Phandelver campaign, and that's where we really began. I said to the guys, it's up to you. You can create your own characters, or we've got some pre-built characters as part of the pack. These are some of the rules I was going to put in place, and we started from there. And actually everybody really enjoyed it while we were sort of face to face. Everybody had a really good time, apart from maybe one person, but you're never going to please everyone, and not everybody has that spark ignited in them as part of the journey. But the sort of the core of the group did, if you like. So Danny, Dave, myself all had a really good time and wanted to pursue this forward. One of my other friends, or one of our other friends I should say, Rob, was also really into it. But as things progressed, just due to the nature of his job and some of the family commitments, he's not been able to really join us on the rest of the journey, even though he had a great time in that first session. And as much as we would love him to join us, he's just not been able to at this point. There's still a gap open there for him, should he ever wish to join, where Dave's brother actually decided, you know what, it wasn't for him, which is perfectly fine as well. I mean, this is a game. It takes up quite a bit of time. I mean, we play Monday evenings from 8 through till about 11, so that's like 3 hours a week. So it's a lot of planning for me, and it's a lot of time for the guys themselves to take out of their week just to sit down and play Dungeons and Dragons. But we all love it. We're all having a great time. And I can't stress how much that's sort of the important thing. One thing I've learned on my journey as a DM is that it's not just about creating the rules, it's not just about creating the world, but it's sort of making sure, if anything, that all my players are having fun. If they're not having fun, and if the story's turning a bit stagnant, then that's where I'm not really doing my job as a DM. So it's an interesting learning curve, and it's been an interesting learning curve. So to take you back to that first session, we had sort of 4 key player characters. We had Ander, played by Danny, Dargon, played by Dave. We had Dawncaller, which was Dave's brother's Paul's character, when I can get my words out. And then there was Trebor, who was Rob's character. And they all came together, typical, so you meet in a tavern type introduction to the world of D&D, and then began on this campaign into the Lost Mines of Phandelver. Stuck to sort of the Forgotten Realms arena, just used that as the basis of both my learning and the introduction for them into the game. Went really well. And then when it came to try and meet up again and try and progress the story forward, it was getting more and more difficult. So I said, you know what, why don't we do this virtually? Let's kick this off virtually. Let's use the tools we've got, whether that's Microsoft Teams or Skype or whatever. Let's just do some things virtually and move this campaign along. And I think actually what we did at this point, remembering back, because it's been a long year through this sort of campaign, I actually think the first virtual session we did was a Halloween session, and I'd been thinking for some time about what I could do in terms of home brewing. I didn't really want to be constrained by the Forgotten Realms space and stick to modules. I had a whole raft of my own ideas that I wanted to introduce and have some fun with and really make it a custom setting. I've always been a massive fantasy fan anyway, we'll put it that way. So I love books like Aragon, all the Garth Nix, I forget the name of the trilogy now, but the Sabriel trilogy, so Sabriel, Lyriel, and the Opossum, and all the books that go along with that, the Old Kingdom series, sorry. Lord of the Rings, all of those sort of Tolkien books, George R. R. Martin, but then I also like some of the modern fantasy settings as well. So I really wanted to take flavours of those books, take flavours of the things that I enjoyed in sort of fantasy settings and bring them into my own game. So as this Halloween one-shot, I did go find some material to use as a backdrop, and I basically just pulled the elements out of that I wanted to. And we entered into a Halloween one-shot which I titled Terror of the Greenwood. So I hadn't quite formulated that full idea about Nylin yet. It was still very much a work in progress. The way we sort of started that is I actually then introduced one of the key organisations within the Malt and Magic setting, or the Forgotten Kingdom of Nylin setting, I should say. Very much based around bringing our love of, as I said at the beginning, we started off with whiskey and poker nights. We've all got very much a love for whiskey, and we like trying different whiskies. Part of the reasons of us getting together was so that we could each bring a bottle, or choose a couple of people to bring a bottle, and sample new whiskies while also having some fun playing games. So I wanted to bring that into the game as well, hence the title of our whole streaming setup, if you like, or just us as a group, is the Malt and Magic group, or Malt and Magic. So I then wanted to bring even more of that into the game. So I said, okay, I want a parent organisation for these players to be something to do with whiskey. And this is where I started to formulate the idea of the Malt Masters. The Malt Masters being a sort of organisation of whiskey distillers, whiskey producers, whiskey manufacturers. But behind the scenes, they're also this organisation that goes out in the world, has their champions, has their workers, their acolytes, whatever you want to call it, their adventurers, who go out and perform tasks, such as hunting down monsters, or clearing out caves, or clearing out dungeons, or the general sort of D&D tropes, whatever you want to pull out there. But there was this then central organisation. So we had the characters, and I think for that Halloween one-shot, that was the first occasion where Rob couldn't make it. He struggled to get on. But we did have Paul's character, Dave's character, and Danny's character. So we had Dawncaller, Dargon, and Ander. I think we also tried to introduce Paul's son to the game at that point as well, which was it was an interesting experience, but he sort of quickly, it wasn't quite fast-paced enough for him. It's just the nature of things. So I actually had them teleported, not quite a full plane shift, but teleported into this new world, this new land, and deposited in a village outside a Greenwood, or what was known as the Greenwood, in this homebrew setting, this land of Nylin. And there was a very Headless Horseman inspired type story, just one shot that we went through. Now, because Rob wasn't able to join, I introduced then a number of NPCs and sort of had them attached to the Malt Masters organisation. I think Paul himself also dropped off halfway through, making the decision at that point this wasn't right for him. So okay, for the sake of the rest of the group, not to detract from their current experience, I thought, okay, I can manage a couple of NPCs and we'll go forward from there. So we just had some sort of sidekick type characters come in for the rest of that. And I think it took us either 1 or 2 sessions to fully get through that one shot. But once we'd done that, it was great. They'd sort of really got a flavour for D&D and really got a thirst for it, really. The fire had very much been fanned. So we continued on and sort of had or set up almost, I think it was a fortnightly call where we would then meet and continue the Lost Mines campaign. We did a couple of face-to-face sessions. I also did a couple of face-to-face sessions with both Dave and Danny on their own. And with that, I used those opportunities to explore the characters a bit more. So Danny's character, and I've got certain things in my mind for the way this story is going to play out, or hopefully play out, depending on what the players do, obviously, in terms of what special things the characters are going to get, shall we say. It wouldn't be D&D if we didn't build up these characters, build up these players to their sort of hero status. So with that sort of one-to-one session with Danny's character Ander, we put him in the Feywild, and there's a very Fey element around the character of Ander. With Dave's character Dargon, there's an undead vanquishing element, shall we say. So his character is a fighter by nature, or a fighter by class, I should say. And there is very much a steer from both me and Dave, actually, for his character to be a bit of an undead destroyer. So we are actively RPing sort of these out, but that gave me a setting for Dave's one-to-one session where, again, contacted by the Malt Masters, in both cases actually for both characters, and Dave ended up in a particular dungeon. Didn't necessarily know where that dungeon was. Again, there was a teleportation or transportation type feature involved, but worked his way through the cave. And with both of these one-to-one sessions, for getting through them and for completing certain aspects, they were granted some gifts. So for example, Danny's character Ander actually eventually, as part of his journey through the Feywild, came to an area that I created called the Summer Grove, with a huge great tree. And the tree actually spoke to him. The tree contained the spirit of a dryad, and granted him a boon, basically. So I can't remember exactly what I've called it, but I think it's something like the spirit of the Summer Grove, or the blessing of the Summer Grove, which just grants him some advantages against Fey type magic. On the flip side, with Dargon, with Dave's character, there was a particular shield that he found, and I think some armour to do with necrotic resistance and being able to vanquish undead. And Dargon, throughout the course of the campaign so far, has actually managed to come into possession of one of the ancient Sunblades. So he's actually found Dawnbringer while we were in the Forgotten Realms setting, and I've sort of brought that across, and we're doing some role play around Dawnbringer itself now and its sentience and how that how the sword interacts with Dargon. Made the sword a female, so there's that sort of male-female interaction as well, and it's interesting to RP that out. And so yeah, that's kind of where we started. And as we progressed further and further through the Lost Mines of Phandelver, I started throwing more plot hooks into this land of Nylin, this Forgotten Kingdom, if you like, and eventually introduced a key enemy as well, which is known as the Eladrin. The players know him as the Dark Eladrin, just to the nature of how he's appeared so far. But this Eladrin character, and we've been building that out as a common force throughout not just the characters' histories, but also going forward. When COVID hit, it kind of threw our ideas around meeting up to try and do D&D into disarray a little bit. Now, we were doing our fortnightly virtual sessions anyway, and I kind of just broached the subject with the guys, or sort of spoke to them about, okay, we're all in lockdown now. Shall we do this once a week, just to try and stave off that lockdown malaise? And so we agreed every Monday night we'd meet up. Primarily we were using Teams, Microsoft Teams, and we were just using some of the tools around that to do a virtual D&D session. So I would have all my kit, so my notebook, my dice, my source books, those sorts of things, and we would just play. We finished the Lost Mines campaign, and then we entered into the Forgotten Kingdom of Nylin. I think we did that just before sort of COVID hit. So most people will know about Lost Mines of Phandelver. If you don't, I'm not going to spoil any details by going into that particular campaign and that module. But once they'd finished that, and once they'd achieved sort of the end objective, before we moved on to the sort of the next steps as part of that module, I cut it there basically and said, right, this is what happened. And the player characters were in a mine. At this point, I'd introduced two key NPCs, which were known as Vraco and Johannes. Johannes was linked directly to Anders' backstory, so Danny's character's backstory, as a mentor of sorts. And Vraco had been introduced to Dargon as part of that one-to-one session. They'd been part of the party, if you like, for the final pieces of the Lost Mines campaign. But once they'd sort of finished the mine bit, so to speak, I then had the Eladrin show up and effectively collapse the cave on them, just to finally fully close out that piece of the campaign. And in true D&D style, or in true fantasy style, had them saved at the last minute by the Malt Masters and transported back into Nylin. The characters then have interacted more with the Malt Masters, and I don't think we've got to it yet in the streaming sessions. So there are 4 Malt Masters themselves, so they are the 4 leaders of this guild. There's the Distiller, the Stillman, the Cooper, and the Blender, all around sort of different tasks within whiskey distilling. Again, trying to keep that theme just as a bit of fun. So they were all gifted special whiskies that gave them different traits. I don't think any of them have actually used those traits yet, or those sort of temporary bonuses that come with the whiskies being almost potion-like. But yeah, so having been introduced to the Malt Masters and then speaking to them, they were introduced finally to this land of Nylin and began to understand a bit more about it. The history they were told is that this land itself is wrought with wild magic. Wild magic events happen all the time. It is not an uncommon occurrence in Nylin, and that is due to the nature of how it has been removed from time and space, and planted almost in a pocket dimension, if you want to look at it that way. The history that the characters know is that there were 3 brothers who were kings of different areas of Nylin. There was one who they now understand to be the king of Shiverspire. There was one who was the king of Phaliad, and another one who was the king of the Black City. And from what the characters understand, each one of those brothers, or each one of these brothers, was actually gifted to a power within Nylin. The history being that actually Nylin was a battleground for these three powers to constantly fight each other, and that was the powers of hell, the powers of the heavens or the gods, and the Fae, all coming together to try and control the innate magic that exists within Nylin, and which is the cause for those wild magic events. That's the history. They are now trying to unlock the reasons why, but also to understand why, even though that Nylin was removed from time and space thanks to a wish from the final brother before he died to stop the combat over Nylin and basically remove it from known existence so that the powers couldn't fight over it and restrict that access to the wild magic. They are trying to understand why they are now able to pass, why the Malt Masters were able to find Nylin, even though they themselves didn't exist within Nylin originally. And there's a bit of backstory around the Malt Masters still yet to be uncovered as to how they first came to Nylin and how they understood, how they built up to where they are now in Nylin. So they're on a journey. So if we think of chapters so far in the story, we've had sort of what I like to call the prologue with the Lost Mines campaign, very much just getting the characters introduced and sort of setting them up on their future journey. And then we've had chapter 1, which I've just for the minute titled sort of the first prophecy. Meeting the Malt Masters, the two player characters are told of the fact that there was an ancient prophecy made by an ancient seer, but they don't know where the prophecy lies, or parts of the prophecy lie. However, due to recent events and their scouring the whole kingdom, they now come to understand that the seer herself was from a village called Telma. So they advise the party to go to Telma and uncover what they can. So the player characters, along with Draco and Johannes, venture out into the wilds of Nylin, down the mountains, along the lake, also known as Lake Telma, I believe. I'll probably have to go back and look at my map. I have a lot of this written down. As a DM, it's kind of hard to keep it all in your head, so I've got maps, I've got all my notes actually in sort of a notebook, digital notebook, and after every session I take my notes that I write, because I find it easier to write during the sessions and then upload them into the digital notebook later. But detracting from the point, so they then sort of circumvented a lake, eventually got to the village of Telma. And part of their task there, they understood as they entered the village and started to get whispers that actually they were not the only ones looking for the seer. There were groups of bandits who had taken over the village and were now searching for the grave of the seer. In true D&D heroic style, they dispatched the bandits, ran them out of town, and found a descendant of the seer who led them just outside the village by the lake to a tomb. They entered the tomb, navigated a number of traps, a number of monsters, and eventually came face to face with the spirit of the seer herself, who granted them some visions. I'm not going to tell you what they are because they will be revealed over the course of the campaign, and you'll understand more about them as we move through the campaign, and also granted them some gifts. So Dargon himself was granted a ring, which he's only just begun to understand what it does, and then Ander was granted a cloak of black material. They've both only recently begun to understand what these magic items can do for them. That was sort of the closing of the first chapter, as the seer then gave them the first prophecy as well. And again, I won't tell you what that first part of the prophecy is. It will come out as part of the campaign and you'll be able to see it for yourselves. I think we've already in one of the sessions actually gone through exactly what was written in that first part of the prophecy. We then moved on to chapter 2. So the group went back to the Malt Master's keep and explained to the Malt Masters what they'd seen, what they'd done about this first part of the prophecy, and some of the visions. And it was then up to them where to go next. So they made the journey to the nearest city, actually, just to try and now investigate more about these prophecies, see if they can uncover any information whatsoever. And they came to the city of Moonbright, which is the biggest trade hub in Nylin, and is actually the closest trade partner for the Malt Masters. It is a city very much devout to the god Cord, and there is a fighting arena there. We called it the Crucible, but there was also a particular mayoral structure in terms of who runs the town. So having been told of this Crucible, Dargon was very keen to go and enter as a champion, and he did become the champion, going up against the sort of previous reigning champion, which turned out to be a Warforged fighter. And as the Warforged was defeated, it actually exploded in a huge, great, almost sort of bomb type explosion. Dargon did manage to get out of the way in time, thanks to some very good rolls. And then, having been the champion, Ander very drunkenly made a lot of bets, made a lot of money, did very, very well, again, thanks to some good rolling. They then came to sort of meet with the mayor, and they wanted to actually visit the Temple of Cord in the city to try and see if they could get any more information from there. They met the mayor and soon came to realise that the mayor himself was under the influence of a malevolent force. His advisor, in true Lord of the Rings Two Towers style, had corrupted him and was working for another force, which they then came to understand was the Eladrin himself. So they fought the advisor. The advisor had an uncanny knack of being able to reincarnate himself or rejuvenate himself after getting down to 0 hit points, but they eventually managed to destroy him and bring the mayor back to himself, and in doing so have been granted the favour of the mayor, and also the loyalty of the local guards, the local army that guards Moonbright. They then went to the temple to try and get more information and sort of tried to understand a bit more about the prophecy, or if Cord could tell them anything. And it's at this point where Dargon's character started to evolve, is the word I'm going to use. And there is a bit of a religious string now coming to Dargon's heart. Now, Dargon's Dave has done his own character backstory in another video, which you'll be able to view. But it's very much around how his character is changing and evolving and wanting to have purpose that was previously lost to him through the events of his history. So there's a little bit of a heavenly element coming into there, which as you watch some of the more recent sessions you'll understand. And that was the first part of that real evolution. They then were subject to their first real wild magic event, where I had a bit of fun as a DM, to be honest, and was able to just drop some monsters that they wouldn't usually see in Moonbright right in the middle in front of them, which they had to fight and understand. Eventually did, gaining more favour with the city. And then through some of their discussions they decided to try and head towards Phaliad Forest. Now, Phaliad Forest, from what the player characters understand, is home to the elves, or at least a culture of elves, but no one has been able to find the actual kingdom itself of Phaliad. The forest is a very vast forest. It's difficult to navigate. Most people get lost and die in there. So they were going to try and find the kingdom of Phaliad. However, on this journey, various things happened, and they realise that actually maybe they need to head to a place called Ironforge, which is actually on an island just off the main kingdom of Nyland, still part of that kingdom, but is actually on an island. So they made their way to a town called Seameet, which is the only known crossing between the main kingdom and the island. And the reason for this is that because of the nature of Nyland, the seas themselves are tempestuous, wrought again with wild magic, to the point where time actually means nothing in this crossing, and it can take anywhere from a week to a month to actually get from from the source of the destination, so from Seameet to Greenflower, and vice versa. So they went to Seameet, met up with various different, I think there were 4 different ship captains that they could interview and really decide who they wanted to try and hire to get them across. Eventually settling on Captain Swift, Charlie Swift, who we may see again in the campaign. It depends on what happens. We had a lot of fun doing some sea-based combat, some sea-based events. So there was an army of Sahuagin, I think is the correct term. And there were some Kraken priests, some weird jelly-like creatures, which for the life of me I can't remember what they were called. Pulled them out of the Monsters Manual as I was researching creatures to throw at them while they were on this sea crossing. But also there was more character development. And I suppose a big piece I've missed at this point is actually the character of Bothrid. I talked about some NPCs in Vraco and Johannes. During that Lost Mines campaign, at one point they came across this band of hobgoblins who basically tried to take them out, tried to sabotage them, and they killed all but one, and they spared the life of this one hobgoblin, who offered, as part of some very, very good rolling in persuasion, to join them and to fight for them and to earn his life in terms of the debt that he now owed to them for sparing him. That itself has progressed a long way. Bothrid has become a core part of the group now. I control him. I don't let him influence the story too much, but it does give me a mechanic as a DM if things aren't quite going, not necessarily the right way, but if things are starting to get too much off into a tangent, or the players are getting a bit too lost in some elements of the story, or just going down rabbit holes, I can use Bothrid to bring them back to a previous point, or just a previous mention of something, or just use him as a mechanic to try and keep them, not necessarily, I don't want to make this sound like it's being too restrictive on the players, but bring them back to a point where they can start to make decisions which will lead them down a better path, rather than killing the story if we want to go down that route. And I'm probably not explaining that very well, but you'll get the idea of how Bothrid works and how I'm trying to use Bothrid as a mechanic as you watch the episodes. So during this sea crossing, Bothrid was with them, and there was sort of the 3 of them. And at this point I'd got rid of the other NPCs just to, now we were in this homebrew setting, I could tailor it more for just the 2 of them, plus this NPC that they'd now adopted as part of the RP, rather than just giving them 2 NPCs because of a module that recommends 4 players. And that was the way I went about addressing that particular piece. They eventually made it across to Greenflower, and that is pretty much, I think, where we are introduced as part of our recordings and as part of our streams now. I think you miss the first part of the Greenflower engagement, where they find basically the local villagers trying to sacrifice a young maiden because their crops have a blight on them and the crops are dying, and the village itself is dying. And there's supposedly a creature in the well in the centre of Greenflower that they must make offerings to, which has previously been in the form of just animals and food, basically, for this creature. However, the shaman has apparently been told by the goddess Melora that that is not enough anymore, and if they want to satiate the creature and save their crops, they must offer the youngest maiden or the most virtuous maiden in the village, which just happens to be the daughter of one of the families. We don't delve into that relationship too much until one of the episodes, which you'll be able to see. But the party decides, okay, we will go and investigate this creature. We will go and deal with this in the well and see if we can help you out. Again, true D&D heroic style. They made that decision. They could have ignored it and carried on their way, but they decided to investigate. Went down the well, found the corpse of a very large creature, which they weren't able to identify. Also found an onyx skull, which we may or may not come back to. The players will have to find out whether that's important or not. Narrowly avoided a blade trap. And then investigating this corpse of this creature, a demon actually appeared, and they had to fight a demon, a Glabrazu, if I'm pronouncing that right as well. And that goes on. That was a very ropey battle, that one. They just about made it through unscathed. And that's where we then land in our very first episode. And that's where we're introduced to the character of Kirek, played by Simao. Simao, during COVID, he himself is a dungeon master. He plays D&D. He's also an actor. So he expressed an interest in just joining the campaign for maybe one evening, just as a bit of fun. So we brought him in, and he's actually decided to stick around, which is great. We have now a third player, and Kirek himself, in the way he plays his character, the way the character is portrayed, brings a different element that the other players haven't previously experienced. Kirek's a cleric. I'm sure you'll be able to see more about this in his introductory video, but that cleric is something the cleric mechanic is not something the players are used to. So now having someone that can heal them and can do different types of spells is really, really interesting, and is changing the dynamic of the group and the way they approach combat, which I love. There's been some real evolution over the last couple of weeks, and hopefully you guys will see that from that first recorded episode to where we are now. So that's sort of the introduction. Very long-winded, but there was a lot to get through. That's sort of a year's worth of content and a year of me and the guys working through different elements. I suppose the final thing for me to say is reiterate again, this is still my first time DMing. This is the first time for the guys playing. Yes, we are using the rules, but as with all D&D sessions, I bend some of those rules. I will get some of those rules wrong. We're doing this for fun. It's not the Adventurers League. We're just trying to have a bit of fun. And because we're having so much fun, and Dave himself is a lighting and sound engineer, an events coordinator as well, it's got to the stage where we thought, what, we've got a lot of the kit. I do a lot of audio recording myself. We've got a lot of the kit. Let's record these so we can watch them back. Then we decided, what, this is cool, let's add some streaming elements into it. So we've now got some custom backdrops and transitions between different views, so you can view maps at the same time. And we sort of built up a couple of episodes to finally release to the internet. So as I say, it's still new for us. We're still learning. We will be learning while we play the whole time. There'll be things we get wrong, things we get right. There'll be funny moments. There'll be moments which may be a little bit arduous as we try and work through them. But I think hopefully for anybody who's not played D&D before, they'll find it a nice introduction, and just see how others approach that. And the only other thing for me to say is sort of the DM of this group is, if you are watching and commenting, be kind, be thoughtful, and yeah, we hope you enjoy. So I shall see you on the next installment. Goodbye.